This lecture is a part of your paper on community, media and society. The module intends to introduce to learners the social structures and inequalities that exist in India. With an understanding of Indian society, the learners would be able to better understand issues of power, inequality, participation and voice, and their relevance in context of community media. Stratified social structures have existed in civilization across the globe since recorded history. They provide basis for differential access of power, privileges and resources to various members of society. In Indian context, the stratification and inequalities based on caste, gender, class, tribe and region are a part of daily life and lived experience of masses which have been competently theorized by scholars. Understanding these social structures and their manifestations is imperative for any critical engagement with members of society. The Constitution of India has enshrined the values of equality and justice in word and spirit. As citizens, this demands our commitment and adherence to the cause of recognizing and removing the inequalities and unfreedoms that influence the lives of vast majority of population in India. Voice of the people provides basis of a democratic society. However, who gets to speak, whose voice is heard and whose voice is recognized are pertinent questions. To explore these, voice needs to be understood beyond its commonsensical understanding of merely having ability to speak. The concept cannot be devoid of its political and social underpinnings. Being able to express is a human need and is intrinsically related to power structures which legitimize voice of some people or special groups while suppress voices of others. Marginalization is a process in which some people and social groups are systematically pushed towards the margins or periphery of development process. They are not merely deprived of power and resources but are also exploited and suppressed. Marginalization brings with it unequal power relations, prioritizing and benefiting those at the core at the cost of these at the margins. In order to challenge the status quo, voice of the people who are subjected to oppression of unequal social structures and marginalized by skewed development process have a critical role to play. The dominant discourse is controlled by the powerful. The voices we hear the most came from the most privileged people. It is noteworthy that absence of recognized voice of marginalized in public sphere should not be understood as marginalized having no voice. Rather, the legitimate voices of the marginalized are systematically suppressed, rejected and even sometimes appropriated. It is in the context we are looking at how voices from the margins can enable us to look at community media with a perspective which is more just, equitable and humane. Who is media? Pick up any national daily and notice what kind of news items make it to the newspapers. What are the issues that take substantial space and to which sections of population do they matter the most? How are different social groups portrayed in the news? It won't take us long to understand that issues that bother minority, urban populace occupy most of the news space as against issues that concern vast majority of rural populace. The newspaper is also meant purposely for literate population that are potential customers with sufficient purchasing capacity of the products and services advertised in the newspaper. The news item have proportionally poor representation of people and issues pertaining to Dalits, Muslims and tribal populations, and often prevalent prejudices and stereotypes are used to portray these sections of population. Objectification of women, reducing them as objects of male attention, is common in news items and advertisements. Thus, we see the media we call mainstream is in fact directed at a small section of population that own resources and power by virtue of their social and economic standings. The proportion of content is skewed in favor of the powerful and their interest is central to the ideology of the media. Media's portrayal of people and issues, the symbols and imagery used are borrowed heavily from the dominant culture or the culture of the dominant. Hence, we understand that the way we imagine, produce and consume media is deeply rooted in the structure of power we live around. Therefore, who owns the media? Who produce media content? Who is the subject of media's work and who consumes the media? These questions are intrinsically related to power and thus impacts the process and product of media work. Media organizations worldwide and in India fare poorly in the representation and participation of poor, women, Dalits, Muslims, tribals and people living in rural and remote geographies. In a strong criticism of Indian mainstream media, Sainath in 2010 highlights disconnect between the mass reality and mass media. Mainstream media organizations imprisoned by profit and hijacked by corporate are serving interest of the elites and are ignorant of poor masses and their plight. Sainath in 2010 and Malik 2012 critiques Indian mediascapes, stating that it is deliberately pushing towards cultural homogenization and consumerist lifestyle with profit-driven agenda and limited access to elites. The production and distribution of news worldwide has always been a male-dominating sphere. Galler in 1995 found women in media work visible but vulnerable because of lack of power and decision making inside organization and outside in economics and social institutions with which media interfaces. Journalism is perceived a serious business, a male prerogative and has been well guarded by rigid gender roles. Women in journalism are lesser than men and are discriminated at workplaces. Their growth is restricted by glass ceiling and are mostly pushed towards soft, non-risky and less important issues. Sexism, according to Joseph and Sharma in 1991, sexism is inherently a part of media practice and of women in media portray them as objects, secondary citizens, passive receivers and less important consumers. Participation of women from low economic sections, from ethnic minorities and other marginalized groups in media is still very poor. In contrast, community media initiatives, unlike mainstream media, do not perceive women solely as consumers, but also as producer and contributor of media content. Marginalization or social exclusion as is a dynamic, multi-dimensional process of progressive social rupture, in which social institutions prohibit participation of individuals and groups in normatively prescribed activities of the society. Marginalization leads to material deprivation, ensuring poverty, emotional and psychological trauma. In Indian context, marginalized communities are commonly identified to be comprising of people belonging to scheduled caste and scheduled tribe as listed in the Indian Constitution. Gopal Guru in 2000, in context of marginalization of Dalits in India, argues that marginalization gets manifested in the political, cultural, academic, psychological and technological realms. According to him, Dalits are kept away from positions of power and responsibilities and are given token representation in politics. Zaxa in 2011 puts lights on plight of tribals whose control of their economic resources and geographical isolation have been snatched, making them vulnerable to exploitation and domination by the dominant social groups. Dipankar Sinha in 1999 held that communication networks are exclusively limited to upper visible and dominant segments of society, and a vast silent majority comprising of lower invisible segments of society are succumbed to silence or subordinate unilateral communication. Sikant in 1994 presents mainstream media in India as communal and highly prejudiced with caste and class hierarchies. Robin Jeffrey in 2014 claims that despite large population of Dalits and scheduled tribes, there are almost no Dalits or Adivasis on the editorial desk of Indian news media today. Voices from within. What happens when one gets to write their own story? It is highly likely that the story is more authentic and reflect a lived experience of that individual and social group. Ability to express and represent people are innately related to identify of individual and community. Telling their stories allows one to express and being heard, empowering them during the process. Community media opens these avenues for populations which are hitherto silenced by mainstream media. The subaltern discourses have emerged from movements of women, tribals, Dalits and other marginalized groups across India and the world. They develop alternate ways of expressing and sharing their stories. Habermas in 1962 theorized public sphere embedded in capitalist Europe, where individuals exchanged ideas and knowledge in a space outside the control of state and economy. Fraser in 1990 finds public sphere theorized by Habermas in 1962 inadequate in critique of limits of capitalist democracies. She provides a feminist critique of Bourdieu's public sphere, which is discussed here. Her central argument is that conception of public sphere was hegemonized by Bourdieu's men and had significant exclusions for women and historically marginalized groups. She also proposes the concept of subaltern counter-publics, which are parallel discursive arenas where members of subordinated social groups invent and circulate counter-discourses, which in turn permit them to formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests and needs. She presents subaltern counter-publics as the public sphere of members of subordinated social groups, women, workers, people of color and gays and lesbians who have repeatedly found it advantageous to constitute alternative public against the hegemonic Bourdieu's public sphere. In Indian context, community media holds the potential for developing such subaltern and alternate discourses, challenging the hegemonic discourses. It gives way to an opportunity where most marginalized have platform to voice their concerns, engage in public debates and solve problems. Voices from within the marginalized could provide us new perspectives and lens to look at other world. From the standpoint of underprivileged, we would be able to recognize how prevailing social and political structures are oppressive and how can these could be challenged to evolve into a society which is more just and egalitarian. Voices from the marginalized could enable us to recognize the plethora of issues that do not find space in our myopic view of the world, which is confined by social hierarchies and material interest. They advocate for issues which otherwise seem mundane. They bring insights from the lived reality of vast majority of population which remains largely unknown and unrecognized by the powerful. Their way of living, worldwide beliefs that do not conform with the dominant perspective are mostly disregarded as backwardness and uncivilized and are the neglected or called out by the dominant voices. Voices from within bring life to these suppressed ideas and practices with a sense of ownership and pride. Not only that, voices from within the marginalized challenge the dominant discourses and attempt to develop counter discourses by bringing evidences from their lives and throwing light on the multiple realities experienced by people living on the margins. Community media brings the platform of not just voicing but getting heard too. Being recognized as producers and consumers of media is empowering for citizens who are devoid of voice and representation. Community media, when owned by community and accessible to most deprived and marginalized people, becomes tool for bringing their issues to the forefront. In many parts of India, groups of Dalit and tribals have taken up the task of representing themselves and getting their voice heard. Women have attempted to carve their way into mainstream media while also creating exclusive spaces and platforms for themselves. A case study. To understand how voices from within the marginalized could influence the way media are produced and consumed, let us undertake a case study. Khyber Lahariya, a participatory community newspaper in India, has been widely recognized and appreciated. Among the national and regional newspapers, Khyber Lahariya holds a unique identity of being a women-run newspaper with a feminist perspective. Most of the women working as journalists come from marginalized communities and some of them are not formally educated. The newspaper publishes in local languages and dialects for rural and semi-urban populace. Also, it functions as a watchdog in implementation of social policies by raising the concern of beneficiaries and highlighting loopholes, delays and corruption in delivery of services. It also follows up stories to ensure change and better access of services for the public as offered by the state. Khyber Lahariya seems to emerge as a community-based media organization serving and involving the local rural communities and communities of marginalized people. Though the ownership and control is not in the hand of community and it operates in a market space with a commercial value, its agenda is not profit-driven. It can be argued that Khyber Lahariya does not make any change to dominant media practices by distancing itself from the mainstream and creating alternative spaces. Journalists of Khyber Lahariya belong to local communities and therefore are aware of local cultural values, beliefs, norms, and indigenous realities. They question the mainstream notions of development, which is characterized by biases against marginalized and are disempowering. As in 1997, Chambers highlights the importance of local knowledge and decision making, Khabar Lahariya encourages the production and preservation of local knowledge, including tribal ways of life and being. It also records and preserves different meanings ascribed to cultural practices and festivals. The journalists do realize that issues that bother men and women are different. Since its emergence, issues of repairing of hand pumps were raised consistently. Being women and rural, the journalists of Khabar Lahariya pay heed to issues that have significance for women. One page is dedicated to Mahila Mudda, means issues of women, as an attempt to claim media space for issues of women. News in this section are not limited to crimes against women, but also include success stories of women who challenge injustice and discrimination. Interestingly, the interest area of women are not limited to household subjects like home science, and information is also published around subjects which are perceived as male-oriented like science and technology. Khabar Lahariya seems to write in a language which does not present them as inferior and less worthy than their male counterparts. As a newspaper, Khabar Lahariya presents an alternative form of media practice which is ethical, healthy and participatory, which could be used to critique and broaden the horizons of their mainstream notions and practices. It enables us to understand how does voices from within the marginalized communities, when take up the task of representing themselves, use community media to empower themselves and members of community. This module introduces on to social inequalities prevailing in Indian society and how they influence the production and consumption of media. In the context of community media, it has been argued that understanding social structures and listening the voices of the marginalized could provide us critical insights into the lived experience of vast majority of population which is marginalized by the dominant structures of power. These perspectives could direct us towards a media practice that is more people-centric and committed to the cause of poor and marginalized people. For more details, please read the modules carefully and attempt the questions given at the end of each module. Thank you.